In the last session, you saw how to build a basic Facebook application using the PHP SDK. The app checked for a valid user session, redirected to the Facebook login and OAuth permissions dialog if necessary, and then returned to display some user data for the currently logged in user. Now we'll go through the steps involved in doing exactly the same with the JavaScript SDK, noticing the differences between the SDKs as we go. Once again, as before, all code samples are running on my local machine on a website called FBCourse, and we'll start this sample by opening the file index.jsbegin from the project files. Index.jsbegin.php serves as a starting point for this example. If you page down to the bottom, you'll see we have a button defined, which will call a function called prompt Facebook login. We have no code for that function at the moment. We have an output div with a note for the user that they are not yet logged into the application. And we have a small function here which will run once the page has loaded. Okay, let's start off by saving this file as index.js.php. And then we can swap over to Facebook and go to the definition of the application. Click Edit to edit the settings. Click the On Facebook tag. And then enter the specifics for our Canvas page and Canvas URL as before. We'll need to find a unique URL for the Canvas page for our application. And enter the Canvas URL, in this case, localhost trainer FBCourse index.js PHP, so that Facebook knows where to pick up the file, which it will display within an iframe inside Facebook when the user goes to apps.facebook.com jscourse_a. We will set auto resize for the iframe size to avoid the showing of scroll bars should our content be too large for Facebook to display comfortably. And we'll click Save Changes. Once again, just to reiterate, if you are writing applications for Facebook after October the 1st, 2011, be aware that you will need to have an SSL certificate for all servers hosting Facebook applications. And if you're going to test locally, as I am, then you will also need to have a local SSL certificate installed and configured as well. Okay, let's jump back into our code editor. And let's start adding some code. You'll notice that we have a div here called FBRoot. And once the document has loaded, it will add a script tag to pull in the Facebook JavaScript SDK into that div. This will ensure that the SDK can load asynchronously once the page has finished loading. And what we're going to need to do now is to pick up an event that's triggered by the final loading of the SDK, then initialize the SDK so that we can then use its functions to work with Facebook user data. So let's paste in some code here. The FBAsync init function will be triggered once the JavaScript SDK has finished loading. We can then initialize the JavaScript SDK by passing in our app ID and various other parameters. The various other parameters are status, which will return us a status code when set to true, cookie. When set to true, we will use cookies for storing session data. XFBML true will allow us to embed social plugins into our app. More of that later. Auth response true means we will be returned an authorization response from the OAuth authorization process, and OAuth true means basically use the OAuth process, as opposed to using any previous authorization methods used by the JavaScript SDK. FB canvas set auto size will basically set the size of the canvas to fit the size of our page, and therefore help to avoid those irritating scroll bars. So let's go over to Facebook. Let's copy our app ID. Go back and paste it in here. And that's all we need to do to initialize the JavaScript SDK. Now let's add the code for the prompt Facebook login function, still inside our JavaScript tags. We're going to define a response variable, and then we're going to call the FB login function of the JavaScript SDK to perform a login, which in turn will prompt the user to accept basic permissions for the application and then return a response to us telling us whether they did that or not. Once we have that response, we should check the response to make sure the user is logged on. If the user is not logged on, or we do not receive a response, then we'll just show an alert to tell them that they're not logged in or that they haven't granted the required permissions for the application. If the user is logged on, then we'll want to go and retrieve some data from the Graph API and to show that data. Here we're going to use the fb.api function of the JavaScript SDK to send a request to the Graph API, in this case the /me request, which will retrieve the data for the currently logged in user. And we're going to check the response of this call. If the response worked, we're then going to retrieve information from the response object, the person's ID, the link to their profile, their username, locale, gender, etc., build a string of HTML, and then set the contents of our output div to this HTML. If you remember, our output div at the bottom currently has a message in it. We'll replace that with the user's details. As before, we can use the ID of the currently logged in user in a Graph API call to fetch their picture connection within an image source tag. The return of this Graph API call will be the actual URL of their profile picture image. And hence, we will be able to display their image quite simply without having to make further calls through the use of the FB API method. If we save that, we then swap back to Facebook, and we type in our Canvas page URL, apps.facebook.com JS course_A. We will see our login button, our initial message. Clicking the login button will cause the dialog to show. You'll notice in this case that the dialog shows as a pop-up as opposed to a separate window. This is one difference between the PHP and the JavaScript SDK. If we click Don't Allow, we're going to see our pop-up alert. We try that again. We'll click Allow, and we'll see the current user's data displayed pretty much as before with the PHP SDK example. So now you've seen how to use the JavaScript SDK to produce a very basic application example. You've seen that one of the differences between the two SDKs is that the JavaScript SDK causes the permissions dialog to pop up in a pop-up window as opposed to a separate window. You've seen also another difference in that the FB login function is called in response to a user action, i.e. a button click in this case. Facebook guidelines prefer that you use an interaction from a user to trigger the login or prompting for permissions for a JavaScript SDK-based application. You've seen with the PHP approach, we can actually go straight into the application, try to retrieve a user, and if there is no user session present, then prompt. We can also do this with JavaScript, and we'll be coming back to that a little bit later, but for the time being, the use of the login button helps to illustrate how this SDK works.